Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Apex office hours. I hope all of you are healthy and safe. My name is Joel Coleman. I'm on the Apex product development team, and we have a special edition today, Apex plus server-side JavaScript equal awesome. I have a few quick announcements to get through, and then we'll get started, okay? The replay of last month's Apex office hours, the 4 partners show that they can deliver solutions using Oracle Apex. That's available now, and I encourage you, whether you're a professional developer or partner, to look at this and see how real large-scale enterprise solutions are being delivered with Apex. And for those of you new to Apex office hours, you can view all past webinars at this link, apex.oracle.com/office hours. Speaking of real-world low-code, last month we launched the real-world low-code Oracle Apex App of the Month. And this is really being done with marketing and writers from Oracle to feature a member of the Apex community each month. And we've had a tremendous response to this. The first 3 are selected, but I encourage people to actually continue their nominations, their contributions. We want to feature you, and we want to feature people from a variety of geographies, industries, and sizes. So please continue the great work there. Last month, I tried to provide some clarity about some minor changes, as I view them, for Apex and Database 21C. Someone from Austria contacted me afterwards and asked, I learned that Apex is not compatible with Database 21C. And then just this week, someone in Italy said Apex is not in Database 21C, so Oracle must be discontinuing it. Both of those are not true. So I tried to provide some clarity to this statement. And if you scan this QR code, you'll see the Q&A on this. But the only thing we're changing is how the bits of Apex are delivered. It's the same license, the same support, the same enthusiasm, same everything, just how the bits are being delivered, okay? There are a growing number of communities that are in place today around Apex. They are in Latin America, India, Pakistan, Middle East, and we are growing this now. And next month, in mid-April at 1400 UTC, we are launching the Oracle Apex East and Central Africa community. And we're working with local Apex enthusiasts there. And I encourage, if you're in this region, to please join us then. Back in 2018, I had a meeting out at Oracle headquarters with the great folks from Oracle Labs. And these are the people who bring you GraalVM, Multilingual Engine, and the like. And they are led by Hassan Chafi, who's the Vice President of Research and Advanced Development, and also Matthias Brantner, who's the Research Director for Oracle Labs. And as you can tell, they are all in on Apex. And the other thing I have to say is there are a number of bright people who work at Oracle. And then there's this group of people who are super bright. And as a longtime Oracle shareholder, I am very glad that people like this work at my company. The last hat tip I have to offer is to Christian Neumuller and Patrick Wolf here, because really they are responsible for the direct integration of MLE in Apex. And this is a multi-year project. This probably started back in 2017, and it has been a lot of work. And they worked very closely with the MLE team on this, what I think is an amazing implementation, which you'll see today. Speaking of what you're going to see today, everything is available now and free. So everything that you see today that Stefan is going to demonstrate, you could do yourself in Database 21C on the always free Oracle Cloud, and then all of the samples that he will demonstrate today, you can also get those today. So I would like to pass this along to our special guests. We have today Dr. Lucas Braun from Zurich, Switzerland, and who's on the Oracle Labs team, and Stefan Dobre, who is a Apex enthusiast and luminary from Vienna, Austria. And I will pass it to you now, Lucas.
Thanks, Joel, and thanks for having us today. I'm really excited to be here with all of you, with so many Apex enthusiasts around the world, and it's really a great opportunity to talk to you today about the Multilingual Engine, GraalVM in the database, how it came to be, what the vision is, and most importantly, what you can do with it in Apex. I'm also very excited that Stefan is here with me today because he will show you a number of really awesome demos that he put together for you. So let's start with the vision of MLE. So many developers today develop their apps directly in the cloud, typically using a platform as a service offering. Now, you might ask, in which language do they typically program? And here's the answer you might get, right? It depends. It depends maybe on the developer's taste, but it might also depend on the problem at hand. Some languages are good at some things, other languages are good in other things. But it's not only about the language, it's also about the ecosystem. So one thing that also matters is how you bundle and deploy your code. So when we talk about JavaScript, we might talk about Webpack, which is a tool that you can use to bundle your JavaScript and deploy it. And in addition to tooling, what also matters is libraries that you can get, and especially open source libraries. So when we talk about JavaScript, we would definitely talk about NPM, which is a big collection of open source libraries, more than 1 million by now. Open source libraries that you have just at hand and which do all kinds of different things and which are definitely very useful. Now, when you program your app, at some point you might process and manage a lot of data, and that might mean that you start communicating with a database. For instance, what I also wanted to mention is that other languages have similar tools or repositories for open source code. Now you want to start talking to a database, for instance, the Oracle database, where you also have a low-code development environment with Apex, which is awesome. Now, that means you can write your code directly in the database, which saves you, all this communication between your app and the database, because you run directly where the data is in the database. Until recently, you had to do this. The only option you could do this was PL/SQL. PL/SQL, most of us know it, we love it. It's a great language. It's very mature. It's very powerful. However, it's something that people that get out of university typically don't know yet, right? So they will need to get some training. Plus, there is some open source code out there, but it's not reaching the millions of open source libraries that you have, let's say, at NPM. So you kind of lose an opportunity here. And that's why we thought maybe in addition to PL/SQL, it would be nice if you could run other languages in the database too. And this is what the Multilingual Engine is about. Basically, take all these nice languages out there and put them into the database next to Apex. And also try to provide good tooling and try to get an ecosystem that is similar to what the people already know today. Now, the core enabling component of the Multilingual Engine today is GraalVM. And that's why I also would like to spend some minutes talking about GraalVM, which is another Oracle Labs project. GraalVM, in one sentence, is a multilingual embeddable virtual machine. So what that means, the multilingual aspect means there are several different languages which you can run on GraalVM. And this ranges from bytecode languages like Java, Scala, Groovy, over some dynamic languages like JavaScript, Python, and others. And then even languages that are LLVM bitcode based, like C, C++, Rust, or you name it. Those languages actually share a common interface and a common data structures underneath, and hence you can actually not only run all kinds of languages on GraalVM, but you can actually combine code from different languages. So you can have JavaScript that calls into a Python package, for instance, seamlessly and with no performance overhead. GraalVM is also embeddable, which means it does not only run standalone, but it can be integrated into other products, like, for instance, the Oracle database, as we will see today. So in summary, why should you use GraalVM? There's different benefits. So it's high performance. So you can also just run your Java application, doesn't even have to be in the database, right? Your Java application with GraalVM, and you will typically get better performance than if you run it elsewhere. GraalVM offers you fast startup. So if you want, you can ahead of time compile your Java application. So that's what AOT stands for, ahead of time compilation, and start instantly. So you get a native executable, for instance, that is as fast as if you compiled this from something like C. GraalVM is polyglot or multilingual, as we said already, so we can mix and match languages with seamless interop, and basically profiting, from all those open source libraries out there, regardless in which language they are written. What is also cool about GraalVM itself is that it's open source, so you can see what's inside, you can track feature progress, you can even contribute. So we have a number of people contributing, even from outside Oracle, to GraalVM. GraalVM comes in 2 editions. So there's the GraalVM Community Edition, around which there is a strong research community. So there's also tons of papers, and you can see a lot of talks, GraalVM talks on YouTube, if you're interested in this. And then there's also the Enterprise Edition, which you can get for free if you're a developer to try out things. But then obviously, if you want to build a product out of this, you have to purchase a license. Or you use it within the Oracle Database 21c on Always Free Cloud already today. So GraalVM in the database, Oracle Database Multilingual Engine, comes with GraalVM Enterprise inside. So what is the Oracle Database Multilingual Engine? It's GraalVM in the database, started as a real pure research project in Oracle Labs, and then got into the product. It was released on December 8th, recently, as part of the Oracle Database 21c in the Oracle Cloud, which is available to you already today. In its first release, it features dynamic JavaScript execution through a PL SQL package called DBMS MLE. And I said it's powered by GraalVM. So I want to quickly talk about the architecture of MLE, but since this is a practical talk, I'm not going to talk about all these boxes and arrows. Instead, we have a blog post article for those of you who are interested, and I really encourage you to read it. I just want to give you some key takeaways from this picture here. So MLE integrates with the database OS layer, and what that means is that it blocks file access, it blocks network I/O, and we use the standard database services for controlling memory allocation and threading. And all of this is pretty important if you think about executing third-party code, third-party JavaScript code in the database. It's important that we have some security guarantees here. We have Substrate VM, which means that we really have fast startup and a low memory footprint again in the database, where you can have many parallel sessions, very important thing. Last but not least, the JavaScript engine that we have in the database runs ECMAScript 10, right? So you can play around with all the latest JavaScript features, which is, I think, also worth mentioning and a really nice thing. Compared to if you write client-side browser code, I think it's ECMAScript 6 at the moment in Apex. So it really gives you some new features here. MLE has a specific way of context management. I'm not going to go into the details here. What is important is just the concept of a context which encapsulates application and runtime state. So something like global variables. And in Apex, there's basically one shared context for an entire page. So what that means is like you can do some stuff on page loading, assign something to a global variable, and then later on read this global variable again on an action code, for instance. Now, how does this DBMS MLE package look like? The basic workflow is that you create a context, you get something like a context handle, and then you use this context handle to evaluate code. You have to give this context handle, you have to give the language. So far, it can be only JavaScript, and you have to give the code itself, which here is just the one-liner, but it can be an arbitrary length CLOP here, so your program can become pretty big. And then when you no longer use this context, you just drop it. Now, we also have ways of exchanging values between PL SQL and JavaScript using DBMS MLE export to MLE and DBMS MLE import from MLE. And then within the JavaScript layer, we have an internal module called MLE.js bindings for importing and exporting. Within MLE, you see the require syntax here, which is JavaScript syntax for requiring or for importing modules. Now, another thing that is important, since you are executing code in the database, you want to interact with the data, so you need a SQL driver. Our SQL driver is called MLE.js OracleDB, and it's modeled after Node OracleDB, which is the Node.js SQL driver for Oracle. And that's something that JavaScript programmers are already used to today when they write applications against the Oracle database. So if you use this module, you first get a connection object. We are already in the database. We don't really have to establish a connection through a connection string or anything. But since we want to have a similar API, you get this default connection, and then you can use this connection to execute a query, to give some bind parameters, and then to process the result. Putting all of that together, you see a bit of JavaScript and PL SQL code here. So, in the declaration, we have the JavaScript code, which basically imports a variable called P1 input and then adds 7 to that and exports it again to a variable called P2 output. And then in the PL SQL part of the script in the bottom, you see how you set this P1 input field, then you evaluate the JavaScript code, and then you retrieve the P2 result. This is all great, but there's still a little bit of boilerplate code here. And now the cool thing with Apex, the cool thing of low code is really that in Apex, you do that with only one line. And with this, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Stefan, who will show you such one-liners and what else you can do with MLE in the database.
All right, just setting up my screen over here. Nice introduction. Thank you, Lucas, for the technical lecture. I say we just jump straight into it. So I am running all of this on the free tier cloud on a 21C instance, Apex 20.2. You can already do everything I'm doing here today. The application that I will be demoing is, as mentioned, on GitHub. So you can really start right away with all of this. I think we should start by imagining we know absolutely nothing about MLE and just finding the place in Apex where I can run my first line of JavaScript in the backend. So to do that, you don't even have to go into an app, just go under SQL commands. And now that I think about it, it would probably make sense to rename this page, right? Because we can now not only run SQL commands, but also MLE JavaScript. So when this page will load, there it is. So we're used to doing things like select star from dual in here, right? And seeing the results right underneath. But now we have this little select list where we can select JavaScript MLE. You will notice the syntax highlighting has also changed because we expect JavaScript. So what's the simplest thing that we can do to test out this functionality? Let's do a console log. very simple example here. Hello, Apex world. We run this and we see our string underneath. You might think, okay, but we can do the same thing, for example, in the browser console, right? And that's true, it is the same thing. This code runs on the browser, while this code is being sent to the database, executed there, and maybe or maybe not, we get some output back. Now, this is pretty basic stuff. So now that we're anyway in the database, let's try to talk to some database object, right? Let's try to read a table. How would we do that from a JavaScript context? Well, let's clean this place up a bit and save our result. Let's try to fetch something and then print it out to the console. So let's read the dual table, right? How do we do that? Well, there is a namespace under Apex called Apex Con, and this will give us the connection to the database. Now, luckily, we don't have to initiate it or purge it at the end or anything. It's already set up for us under Apex Con. What else is in there? We see commit, execute, a bunch of interesting things from this autocomplete. I think we're interested in executing something. So a SQL text is expected. So let's just run select star from dual. And then we can actually access the rows, and we know there's only one row. So let's access it at index 0. And then we expect the column name, and we know the column name is called dummy. Let's rerun this, and we see our little X. That is correct. Of course, this would be much easier to do in pure SQL, but it is just a exercise to see how the two operate together. Now, how about changing the column alias? Oh, select dummy. If you change the column alias, you also have to change it right here. Good, good, good. How about passing some, we know how to pass data out, right? This is how we do it, but how about we pass some data in? And to do that, let's have our data in here and say, hello, Apex world. And we want to use it in our query here. And we do that via a bind variable. So let's call this 1, and we can pass it as a second parameter here in an array. Let's rerun this. There it is. Hello, Apex world. So we did a bit of a round trip. We could have just printed this out, but just for a demo, we sent data into this query and we got data out again. And you can do here all types of DML operations, right? Update, delete, all of that stuff. You can also run PL SQL. So to do that, if you are in a JavaScript context and you just want to run, you can just begin end, wrap it in an anonymous code block. So begin end. What can we do? DBMS output. That line might have some quotes issues, so let's double quote this. Say hello world and run this. Missing semicolon. There it is. The same thing with a bind variable. We could have passed a value in from JavaScript as well. But these are the basics, right? We have a nice JavaScript context. It gets executed in the database, and we can pretty easily run SQL and PL SQL from inside of there as well. But now we're only in SQL commands, right? So let's see inside of an actual application how we can embed some cool JavaScript. So we have this little app, and let's just, I suggest I show some the actual facts first. You can add this here and it can look like this, and then we can get into the really nice examples. So stick around to the end for some more interesting things, but just to cover the bases. MLE code can be written in things like processes, computations, validations, and also the execute server-side code dynamic action, which used to be called execute PL SQL code. But as we start supporting more and more languages, things will be named more generic, right? So execute PL/SQL code becomes a more generic execute server-side code. So let's show how we would do something, how we will run a process in pure SQL, and let's translate that same process in JavaScript. So I have some input here, and I can say hello world. And what this process does is reverse that string. Let's click this button. There is my reversed string. Let's see how that was built. Our little page process after submit with a little bit of PL/SQL that uses the reverse function, and we can reference page items via these binds as we're already used to. Now let's do the same thing in JavaScript. So I'll remove this. Let's choose another string. Let's see if this works. There it is. We have just reversed this string. How is this done? The same logic, but only now our code, well, there is one major difference. In this process, we had selected language PL/SQL, but in this other process, we have selected language JavaScript. So that's all you have to do. And then your code will run in the appropriate context. In JavaScript MLE, there are no more bind variables to access items. We reference items via apex env and then the item name. That's how we assign a value to it, and that's how we read a value. And this is just the reversing logic. So I'm not sure you would prefer one or the other for this simpler example, but I'm just showing how you can achieve the same thing in two different ways. The same thing for the AJAX way of processing things via the execute server-side code dynamic action. This is looking good, and let's reverse it again in JavaScript. It's looking good. So in the execute server-side code, we have items to submit, we have items to return, and the same code, right? Of course, language PL/SQL. Doing the same thing in SQL. In JavaScript, we select JavaScript as our language. The way we submit items stay the same. The way we return items stays the same. It's just our code changes and the way we reference various items. And it just works out of the box, right? We don't have to do anything else, which is very neat. In which other places can we run JavaScript code? We mentioned computations, validations. I won't show you examples for these, but you can easily see when you create a validation, you now get this little language selector here. So in all of these places, you could use SQL or PL/SQL. Now you can also use JavaScript. One note before I get to the really cool examples. Say you start writing your code, right? And you choose JavaScript for whatever reason. And you hit a button, you know what's going on. So for example, I have here this run button that runs a very complicated server-side process. So written in JavaScript. So let's click this button. And I was expecting in this page item to get some sort of result. So I don't know what's going on. When it comes to debugging, I want to show you a few tricks that I learned that might help you in the future. So our little button here triggers this process that is written in JavaScript. Okay, so by the way, not only can you access page items under apex env, you can also access any other environment variables such as app user, app ID, so on and so forth. So in my very complicated bit of code here, I'm checking if app user equals my name, and I'm assigning this. And I think I'm logged in as Stefan, so I don't know what's going on. A very easy way to debug this stuff is to console log stuff. So let's console log something and see where this stuff actually ends up. So I thought my app user was indeed Stefan. I guess it's time to check. We click OK. We run this page again. We click run. We check the debug logs. Oh, first turn on debug. Let's do this again. And then we can check the debug logs. 2 seconds ago, accept run. This is looking good. We search for those exclamation marks, and there it is. So anything that we output via console log will end up in here. It's basically like calling apex_debug.message in PL/SQL. They end up in the same place. So it turns out my username is actually uppercase, so that's why my code wasn't working. So let's try that again. Let me run this. It's looking good. My code ran successfully. Now, another pointer I would have when it comes to debugging, because JavaScript is such a dynamic language and we can create all of these objects in the global scope or dynamically include libraries and things, we might need to, at times, check out what's in global this. So in the browser, you would have the window object, right? Well, inside of JavaScript MLE, you have global this, which kind of holds everything together. So let's just check what's in global this. It might come in handy when you're dealing with such problems. When we check global this, we see, oh, an object global. Well, that's not very helpful, right? That is because we're trying to probably toString an object, right? A better way of figuring out what's in global this is to JSON.stringify it. And then we can actually see the object attributes and the values of global this. Let's rerun this. Let me scroll down, there it is. So if you really start developing, you will probably have to deal with global this to import various libraries and expose things globally. This is how you can actually debug what's going on. So I've been needing really to JSON stringify things probably for every example that I developed. Okay, so this is how we can run JavaScript MLE inside of a regular Apex app, but really that's not what all the fuss is about, right? PL/SQL does a decent enough job. We're happy with it. But where I personally see the main benefit is loading third-party JavaScript libraries, right? NPM modules, of which there are thousands that don't exist for PL/SQL, right? So why not just leverage those? Now, how do we get those fancy libraries from the interwebs? Well, first we should get the source and store it in a table inside of a CLOB column, right? So I've created this page, which is based on a table. And in this table, I'm storing the library name, let's say, and the library content as a CLOB. If you download this app, you will see that you get a nice little interactive grid where you can paste in the library name, a link from a CDN or a GitHub repository or whatever, and on save, Apex will go ahead and fetch the actual library into that CLOB column that I mentioned. Of course, this is just one way of doing it. You can simply copy paste the library in SQL Developer or whatever tool. Just make sure the library has some name and the code in a CLOB, right? I think from what I hear, loading such modules will get easier with upcoming database versions and the Apex versions. But for now, this is the little bit of setup that we need to have to get going. So now we have these libraries stored in a table. How do we actually invoke them? And the solution I came up with, there might be better ones, right? But what I thought about was creating a application process that runs after page submission, that sort of sets everything up for us. And I will show you that code right now when this page loads. A couple of seconds. Right. So, by the way, application processes can also be written in JavaScript now. So that's neat. A little bit of code for fetching the content out of our table and returning it as a string. Not too interesting. Little bit of decorate module, not too interesting. What's interesting is the fact that we expose two functions, require module and load script. They do fairly similar things. But we expose this function under global this, which means that in any subsequent processes, be that computations, validation, processes, branches, whatever, we now have access to require module which based on a module name or library name, right, will fetch that content out of the table, execute it, and maybe return something. But after that point, after we use require module, we can actually use that library, which is very cool. So let's just go straight to an example. Form validation. I thought about here, we have a little form and we want to validate for a correct email address and a correct credit card number. And we could go ahead and implement this logic in PL/SQL, or we could just use a library that thousands of other JavaScript users are using. So this library is called Validator, I believe, and we use it in the following way. So very simple page with a submit button and two validations, regular Apex validations. But here we made sure to set the type to expression and the language to JavaScript MLE. And because in that application process, which would happen somewhere around here, we expose that require module function, we can now simply use require module from basically from here on downwards, we have access to it. So we require our fancy JavaScript library, which happens to expose a couple of utility functions. Is email, is credit card number, and a bunch of others. But for this example, we just use is email. We pass in the page item, and this whole thing will simply evaluate to a Boolean. If it's true, we're good. We pass the validation. If it's false, we go ahead and show the error message. Same for the credit card. We require our module. We use the is credit card function and pass in this other page item. So let's just demonstrate it. Let's put in an invalid email address and an invalid credit card number. Let's try to submit and see what happens. Very good. Our email address is indeed invalid. And our credit card number, it seems right, but clearly it has some smarter checks. And I have this dummy credit card number that should work. We submit the page, our validations pass. It was very fast. And we now use functionality which would otherwise not be available in Apex, at least too easily, right? I looked in here, I don't see a item is valid email, which is why we can use this library. And it's very smart, by the way. So I was trying to break it, maybe confuse it with some little dashes, and it's smart enough to accept that as well. So that's a very simple example. They will get more and more complex because that was the exercise to see how far we can really take JavaScript inside of Apex. Next example, we have QR code generation. For this, I'm using a library called QR code, but I know there is a bunch of them. So I just picked the first one I saw. It happened to work. So I stuck with it. What we should do is give a URL, something like apex.oracle.com, click create, and see what happens. We just created a QR code, and we did that only on the server. Let's quickly look at this code. A simple page process. We require the module that's stored in that table. We will have a handle on that library, and we can, I guess it's a function which we can use to call some specific library options, and then just store in this case, I'm using base64, store that as a string in this other item, and the image will be shown. Of course, you can also use this library to export an actual blob and save that in a table somewhere. Now, the question is, why would I do this on the server as opposed to the client? Because we can already today use all of these libraries on the client, and we've been doing that for years, right? Well, I think there's a number of reasons why doing things on the server sometimes makes sense. So let's take this example, QR code generation. You would want to create a QR code on the server maybe because you want to embed it in a document that also gets generated on the server, maybe because you want to email it somewhere out of the database, right? So that would not be possible with client-side execution of this library. And also, in general, we cannot always trust things that come from the client, right? So it's always good to do things on the server. So JavaScript MLE really enables us to do that. Next example, we have Markdown to HTML. And for this, I used a library called Marked, which is the de facto standard library. What we have here is some input where we're going to write some Markdown, and we're going to see the output here on the right. So let's say this is my title. Let's have some bold text, and let's have some italics text and some code block. Language JS. So we have this bit of Markdown. Let's convert it into HTML. There it is. That was very fast as well. So that's nice. I have not experienced any too big of an overhead using JavaScript MLE so far with my examples. That's the escaped output, and this is the unescaped output. So it seems fine. Again, why would we want to do this on the server and not on the client? Because maybe you want to email your this content, right? And we cannot use client-side JavaScript in an email context. Again, maybe we want to include it in a report. Or another reason, if you have a public-facing application, let's say a public forum, it's always good to have stuff pre-rendered because that's more search engine optimization friendly. So when Google crawls websites, it prefers things are already there in their final form without having to wait for JavaScript to perform all of these conversions. It's also lighter on the client, right? You don't have to load the marked library on the client if everything is already converted. Let's just look at the code a little bit. Also very simple. Require module marked. Do some option setting. Convert this and set it into here. All right, HTML sanitization. So we're getting more and more advanced here. But if you've ever worked with a rich text editor in Apex or wherever else, you'll know that it exports HTML, right? And we don't just want to escape that HTML when it comes out on the client again, because then it would the whole document would not be rich text anymore. It would just be plain text. So we have the problem of we want to allow HTML, but there might be certain vulnerabilities, right? Like cross-site scripting. And that's been a problem for a while. Usually the user solves it by running a DOM purify library on the client. But then again, you have to do that on the client, and we discussed why on some occasions it's better to have everything already be done on the server. So let's just go into an example. Say you have this nice piece of HTML. Of course, this would come from a rich text editor or whatever. Let's say we have a heading. And this is not quite clean HTML. So somehow a little bit of suspicious code got in here. In this case, it is a script tag with an alert. And of course, that's not too bad, but if the attacker manages to run an alert, they can also do other things like steal cookies and hijack sessions and so on. So we really don't want this being executed on the other side. So let's submit the page. Uh-oh, we see an alert, which means when rendering this HTML, this piece of malicious JavaScript was also executed. But with the DOM purify library running in the backend, we can actually clean this up. So if we sanitize this input, submit it again, there it is. The script tag is gone from here. And this is not just, it doesn't just use a regex to get rid of this stuff. It is quite a complicated process to get rid of it. So I suggest you look at the code if you're interested more in this topic. But I had to deal with this in the past, and I had to use a Java library, embedding that into the database, which was quite a mess to get over this this problem. So I think JavaScript MLE would have come in real handy back then. Okay, my last example here is image manipulation. And this is still experimental. I'm still testing out different libraries, see what the performance differences are. So I wouldn't call it quite production ready yet, but it is a good proof of concept. Also with Oracle Multimedia Oracle Multimedia going away, people are looking for alternatives. And I've seen calling REST APIs and all sorts of things, but why not just use a JavaScript library and do it right inside of our Apex app? So I'm using a library called GIMP here, which runs as a process, and it can do a number of things. It can crop images, flip them, apply watermarks, so on and so forth. So let's quickly test this out. We need an image, and I'm just going to make a tiny screenshot of this. Put it back here. That will be our base image. Let's upload it, and let's try to flip it vertically. That will take a bit. And our image was manipulated in JavaScript inside of the database fairly quickly, which is nice. Of course, people don't just want to flip images. You probably want to resize them or compress them or apply a watermark. And this library and all of the other libraries can do all of this stuff. But for demo purposes, let's just try to apply a watermark. I'm just going to apply this little bit of text. Of course, you can also apply a watermark as text, but let's just do it with two different images in this demo. And we don't want to flip anything. So let's process these two images. And we can see that our base image and this watermark image are now combined into one output image, which you can take as a blob, store it in a table, whatever. So I thought this was extremely impressive stuff when I got it to work. Of course, you can do some cropping. 100. Oops, I have to re-upload the images. And these are just some options. This library can do all types of things with colors and filters. And yeah, it is a bit cropped. Yeah, I don't know if I would go to GIMP if I were to implement this again. There's other libraries that I'm trying to get working, and I will make sure to blog about it when I manage. These were my demos, but there are thousands of libraries out there that could make sense in an Apex context, in an Oracle backend context. So I think with time, more and more people from the community, people in the audience are going to start experimenting with this stuff, and we're going to start seeing some cooler and cooler demos come up. I've also played around a bit with other image manipulation libraries. I played around with PDF generation. I played around with OCR, text recognition libraries. Theoretically, I don't have a demo right now, but all of that stuff should be possible. So I would expect people to manage to integrate that. What can I say? I'm extremely looking forward to the future of server-side JavaScript in Apex. And with that, I think I'll pass it back to you, Joel and Lucas.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. This was just magnificent. There are a number of questions that came in, and some are for you, Lucas, and some are for you, Stefan, and I will just get going. I will tell people that this is on database 21C on the always free version, and those are available today on the Oracle Cloud in the Ashburn, Phoenix, Frankfurt, and London regions. Also, a question came up, if you're running database 19c in Oracle Cloud, can you just upgrade to database 21c? And today the answer is no, that you would need to provision a new 21c database for that. So on to the questions here. And I guess this is really for you, Lucas. So Kevin Zhang, and nice to see you join us, Kevin. What's the catch for GraalVM? It sounds too perfect to be true. Every technology platform is aimed to solve certain issues. What issue is GraalVM trying to solve that other platforms can't solve nicely?
So I think I can talk a little bit about the secret sauce of GraalVM. Secret sauce, although I mean you can go and Google it yourself, right? But so there are three key things here. So first of all, there's the GraalVM compiler, which is really a state-of-the-art compiler. A lot of research went into that, right? And that is shared across all those languages, right? And then there's this interface called Truffle that offers a unified representation of abstract syntax trees of all these languages, or unified representation of interpreters if you want. And this allows you to really have a holistic view on all the language code, right, across languages, and therefore execute this efficiently. And then the last thing is this feature called GraalVM native image that allows you to compile Java code into a native executable or a native binary in the case of MLE. And that actually means you compile GraalVM itself, plus in our case, the GraalVM JavaScript interpreter, plus any other language interpreters that you want to have to native code. Again, a lot of research, of course, went into making that happen. But these are three key components that compose the success of GraalVM today, which actually also brings me to some further reading. So in our blog, like the second one here, we elaborate on a couple of those, but also if you go to graalvm.org, you will find a lot of information about this state-of-the-art compiler and all the cool stuff it does and why it's so performant. I hope this answers the question, and I hope my mic is fine now.
It's good. I'm going to send you a new mic. No offense.
Great, thanks. Not going to say no to that.
Yeah, this isn't really a question. This is almost so Matthias can get a gray hair. Someone asked if MLE could be backported to database 19.
I guess that's way above my pay grade to decide, but it's also very difficult. I'm not sure.
I mean, I almost wanted to mention that at the beginning when I was even showing the picture of the MLE team, that this was a Herculean software engineering effort. I mean, it's amazing, right? It's unique in the world in terms of complexity and scope. And the fact that the labs team was able to pull this off is extraordinary. Okay, this is a simple question. Someone asked, Arun asked, do we need the VM to run JavaScript in the database? And I think he's referring to, well, I'll let you, Stefan, or Lucas answer that.
Well, the question is which VM we are talking about, right? If we talk about GraalVM, it's basically built into the Oracle database 21c. As I said, it's natively compiled. So right now it includes the Graal compiler and it includes the JavaScript interpreter and basically our MLE implementation, right? But this comes with 21c, so there's no additional VM or anything that you need to install. If that is the question, I'm not sure I understood it correctly.
I think so. So a couple questions here, and I hope I answered this correctly. Someone can feel free to say differently. Someone asked if MLE is tied to any database edition. So, there's SE2 and Enterprise. I think this is just part of every database, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
You are correct, Joel.
Yep.
As far as I know, yeah.
And our buddy Sonny asked, what if there are issues using GraalVM? Is it fully supported by Oracle?
I mean, it's part of the database, so it has the same support as the Oracle database as a whole, right?
That's right.
I mean, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if you're using MLE, right? If you use GraalVM outside the database, that's a different thing. And if you have an enterprise license, there's also support, right? But if you use MLE, so GraalVM in the database, it's part of the database, and you get the regular database support.
That's right. Whether you're running this on premises or eventually if you're running database 21C on autonomous database in the cloud, it's supported. It's a feature. Okay. Anonymous attendee asked, where are all these modules like QR code, et cetera, loaded? Are they loaded in the database? If yes, which location? If any library has a dependency on other libraries, then how are they handled on the server side?
Right. So right now, as things stand, you can load this library wherever you wish. I just used a local table in the parsing schema of my app in a CLOB column. Of course, you could also load it in a static file. I think I saw a comment about that, but that's a binary file, right? So you would have to make it a CLOB and then interpret that. The second part of the question was, sorry, what again?
Yeah, if any library has a dependency on other libraries, then how are those dependencies handled?
Right. So I touch a bit about that in my in the GitHub repository in the README. But yeah, you have to be careful. If a library is compiled for the web and it is just a singular file, you could expect it to work. Let's put it like that. If a library is a pure Node.js thing that requires other modules, you might have to bundle that together yourself into one package. And that's a process called the browserifying. So there's a tool called browserify, which can help you do that. I think I did that with one of the things in my demo. But I do think in future database versions, there might be some enhancements there as well concerning dependency management.
Yes, indeed. I mean, that's a nice bridge to my slide here about future directions of MLE, of course, with no guarantees whether that will ever happen or in which database version. But one thing that we want to certainly improve in that sense is the developer experience with modules, right? So right now, Stefan had this very nice gluing code and this interactive grid to store modules in a CLOB table. But going further, we are really looking into ways of letting you manage modules in MLE, whether you are in Apex or just using the database standalone, right? So that's definitely on our roadmap to look how we can improve there.
Okay, thanks. A couple more questions. Christian asked, will it be possible to use the MLE JavaScript functionality in plugin development using the library files uploaded with the plugin? And I assume that he's talking about an Apex plugin. Could that include JavaScript libraries that ultimately get stored server-side?
I don't see a reason why not, but currently the plugin interface only accepts PL SQL. That would be an enhancement request for Patrick, right, to allow us to write our plugins in JavaScript MLE. But if you're willing to write that wrapper code for opening the context, closing the context, that should be doable, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Ilmar has asked, how does performance compare when running JavaScript on server versus PL SQL? Also, can you run any JavaScript library that runs on the browser also on the server, or are there any limitations? Great question.
So for the JavaScript part, MLE has a pure JavaScript environment, which means it's now neither a browser environment, so you don't have something like a window object, right? Nor is it a node environment where you have something like an OS or a file system module that you can use. So there are, in that sense, limitations, right? So basically, as a rule of thumb, any NPM module that works for both browser and Node.js typically works with MLE. Right, but if you're using some of the browser-specific bits or some of the node-specific bits, it might not work intentionally if you want, right? Because we are not in a browser, and we are not in a file system, and we don't want to give file access or anything of that like that.
I have an addition to that. I did use one library, which is DOM Purify, that expects to run in a browser environment. And how I got around that was using even another library called the JS DOM, which sort of mimics a web environment, right? So you create an instance, and then it gives you a window object and a document object, and then DOM Purify just worked.
And if you think about a node file system, for instance, right, you could implement your own kind of file system, mimicking a file system, and have it on top of a table with a CLOB column, right? But you would have to implement that then. And again, if with better module support, we might allow you to have modules that depend on each other, and then you could have like your own file system implementation based on your CLOB table.
Okay, it's 2 after. So last question from Wiseacre Joel, me. Are there any other languages planned for the future?
I mean, the name of this feature is Multilingual Engine, right? So clearly we aim at adding more languages in the future. But at this point, it's really not possible to tell you which language or which languages and when they will appear. But certainly that's something that we are looking into.
Okay. And on that note, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much, Dr. Braun. And Stefan as well, thank you very much. This was just a spectacular session. And you opened up my eyes, and I think of many in the Apex community. As well, thanks to everyone who attended today. This replay will be available probably in a couple days on apex.oracle.com/office hours. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks, and I wish everyone a great day. Bye.